Picture a house where every creak screams a buried secret, where the air hums with sorrow and vengeance. This story will grab your heart, twist it with fear, and leave you aching for redemption. If you love tales that chill your bones and stir your soul, you're in for a wild ride. Come join Nightmorn on YouTube, where I spin haunting stories with gripping narration and spooky vibes. Hit subscribe, tap the bell, and give a like to keep these eerie tales coming. Ready? Let's dive into the darkness. Chapter 1. The new beginning. The key to escaping your past, I'd always thought, was to build a new future. But as I pulled my beat-up Ford F-150 up the long, overgrown driveway of the Miller house, I realized I hadn't built anything at all. I had simply run. The house stood before me like a forgotten monument to a more ornate and perhaps more brutal era. It was a sprawling Victorian mansion, a skeletal wreck of what must have once been grandeur. Turrets jutted into a bruised Ohio sky, their shingles peeling like sunburnt skin. The intricate gingerbread trim, once a sign of prosperity, now hung in jagged splinters. A single, ominous oak tree stood in the front yard, its gnarled branches reaching out like arthritic fingers. It was a beautiful decay, a testament to time and neglect. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust, mothballs, and a century of trapped memories. My footsteps on the hardwood floors echoed, each creak and groan a new voice in the empty conversation. I ran my hand over a dusty banister, and a familiar pang of guilt struck me. This house, this legacy from a distant uncle I'd met twice, was meant to be my fresh start, a place to forget the past, to forget Sarah and the life I'd dismantled with a single, thoughtless act of infidelity. I was a ghost in my own right, haunting the ruins of a life I'd carelessly destroyed. I felt a profound sense of loneliness, an echo of the life I had so recklessly thrown away. My new life, if you could call it that, was to be a graphic designer working remotely. I set up my laptop on a folding table in the massive dining room, ignoring the portraits on the wall, the family in the portraits with their stern expressions and stiff collars seemed to watch me. I tried to focus, but the house had a way of pulling my attention. I couldn't shake the feeling of being an intruder, a trespasser on a history I didn't understand. The next day, a car pulled into my driveway. An old woman, Mrs. Callahan, got out. Her hair was a tight grey bun, and her eyes, though kind, held a glint of steel. She brought me a warm casserole and a warning. "Heard you were moving in," she said, her voice a low murmur. "It's a beautiful house, in its own way. But some things just won't be forgotten." She told me about Eleanor Miller, a woman who had lived in the house in the late 1800s, a woman who was beautiful, vibrant, and according to Mrs. Callahan, loved by everyone except her husband, Thomas. The old woman's voice dropped to a near whisper as she recounted the story of Eleanor's accidental death in 1892. The town believed Thomas had killed her in a fit of jealous rage and covered it up. Her spirit, it never left, Mrs. Callahan said, her eyes fixed on the house's attic window. She's still looking for justice. Then came the rules. They weren't a warning, they were a plea. "Don't open the attic door after 10 p.m., she said firmly, "and don't you dare say her name out loud at night. Not her full name, anyway. Just be quiet and respectful." I nodded, feigning seriousness. To me, it was just small-town gossip, a bit of morbid folklore to add character to my new home. I had seen enough real-life tragedy to be unfazed by ghost stories. That night, As a storm rattled the windows, I heard the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, coming from the attic directly above me. My rational mind told me it was the old house settling, the wind playing tricks, but my heart, a little bird trapped in a cage, began to beat faster. The locked attic door seemed to call to me, a puzzle begging to be solved. Ignoring Mrs. Callahan's warning, I grabbed a flashlight and went upstairs. The attic door, with its rusty, ornate lock, was cold to the touch. I didn't try to open it. I simply stood there, listening to the soft, rhythmic sound of footsteps. They stopped as soon as I reached the door. The silence was more unnerving than the noise. As I turned to go, my flashlight caught a glimmer on the floor. It was a silver locket, tarnished with age. I picked it up, my fingers tracing the delicate carving of a forget-me-not. I flipped it open. Inside was a faded photo of a young woman with kind eyes and a faint, sad smile. Eleanor Miller, a soft, melodic lullaby so faint it could have been a memory, drifted through the air. I dismissed it as the storm winds. I told myself it was nothing. But as I went back downstairs, the feeling of being watched was no longer a vague sense of unease. It was a tangible, icy pressure on my back. The next morning, I called my friend, Sarah. She was a librarian with a love for history and an insatiable curiosity. I told her the story of Eleanor Miller, leaving out the parts that made my skin crawl. "Sounds like a classic American Gothic," she said, her voice bright and full of energy. "I'll see what I can dig up." Local newspapers, historical society records. "I'll find her." And she did. A few days later, she sent me a link to an archived article from the Willow Creek Gazette. The headline, yellowed with time, read, "Beloved Mrs. Ma. Miller dies in tragic accident." The article spoke of a fall down the main staircase. It mentioned Thomas Miller's heartbreak and the town's grief. But Sarah had also found something else, a tiny, almost hidden section on the back page, mentioning that the sheriff's investigation had been mysteriously and abruptly closed, despite a number of conflicting witness reports. The article hinted at a cover-up, just as Mrs. Callahan had suggested. It gave a name too, a local judge, a man with a suspiciously close relationship to Thomas Miller. That night, I woke up with a cold gasp. A strange weight pressed on my chest, a feeling of dread so heavy it felt physical. The lullaby, clearer now, was playing. It wasn't the wind. It was coming from inside the house. I sat bolt upright, and my hand brushed against something cold on my pillow. It was the locket. I had left it on the kitchen counter the night before. I picked it up, my hands trembling. The locket was open, and as I stared at Eleanor's faded photo, a faint, disembodied whisper, as dry as fallen leaves, snaked its way into my mind. "You're like him," it said. The words were not a threat. They were an observation, a judgment. My past had found a home here, in this house of ghosts and secrets. My skepticism evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard knot of fear. Chapter 2. The Rules of Survival. "So you're telling me," Sarah said, her voice a mix of disbelief and morbid fascination, "that a ghost whispered to you and a piece of jewelry teleported itself onto your pillow?" I stood in my kitchen, nervously wiping down a counter that was already spotless. "I know how it sounds," I admitted, my voice a low, tired drone. The house felt heavier now, its silence no longer peaceful, but a tense, watchful predator. My skepticism had been an armor I thought was impenetrable, but the past few nights had chipped away at it, leaving me feeling exposed and vulnerable. Sarah, a tall woman with an academic's sharp eyes and an artist's messy bun, didn't seem scared. She seemed intrigued. She had driven out to Willow Creek, a box of old books and a thermos of coffee in hand, ready to confront my haunted house head-on. She had been my rock through the divorce, the one person who hadn't judged me for my mistakes. She pulled a small, leather-bound book from her box and laid it on the counter. "This is it," she said, her tone hushed. "The Miller family diary. I found it in an old archive. It belonged to Eleanor. I hesitated to touch it, as if its pages held the ghost's essence. The diary felt cold and heavy in my hands. The paper was yellowed and brittle, the ink faded but still legible. As I read the first few entries, a chilling narrative unfolded. Eleanor's words painted a picture not of a woman in a happy home, but of a prisoner. She wrote of Thomas's controlling nature, his sudden bursts of jealousy, and the way he would lock her in the house for days. "He says it is for my protection," one entry read, "but I know it is only to keep me." The words resonated with an uncomfortable familiarity. A flashback, sharp and unwelcome, sliced through my thoughts. I was on the phone with my ex-wife, her voice tight with hurt and anger. "You promised me a future, Ethan. You promised me a life." My own infidelity wasn't a jealous rage, but a slow, quiet betrayal, a breaking of promises. I had promised my wife a life she didn't get, just as Thomas had promised Eleanor love he didn't give. I had betrayed my own vows, and Eleanor's ghost, it seemed, could see right through me. The cold voice from the previous night echoed in my ears. "You're like him." I felt a profound, sinking guilt. I had been so focused on running from my past that I hadn't realized I was running towards its mirror image. The house wasn't just a place of ghosts. It was a physical manifestation of my own moral failings, a constant reminder of the pain I had caused. And the ghost, Eleanor, was a vengeful mirror, reflecting my own sins back at me with terrifying clarity. The doorbell rang, a harsh, anachronistic chime that shattered the tense atmosphere. It was Mrs. Callahan, back with more than just a casserole. Her demeanor was different now. The nosy neighbor had been replaced by a woman burdened with a terrible secret. "She felt you here," Mrs. Callahan said without preamble, her eyes darting nervously towards the attic door. "Your friend. The research. It's stirring her up. She didn't mean me. She meant Sarah. The rules she gave me last time weren't the full story. She explained them now, not as vague superstitions, but as a century-old containment ritual. The rules aren't to keep you safe," she whispered, her voice cracking with fear. "They're to keep her in. The house is a cage, and the rules are the bars." Her new rules were more specific and far more terrifying. "First, never speak her name with anger," she said, her finger jabbing at me. "She feeds on it. It's what drove Thomas, and it's what binds her here." Her eyes met mine, a silent accusation. My angry muttering of "Eleanor, stop it," a few nights ago, had been a grave mistake. "Second," she continued, "never open the attic door without a clear purpose. It's where they found her. It's a wound, and if you open it just to look, she'll see it as an invitation." "And finally," she said, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper, "if you hear her singing that lullaby, you must cover every reflective surface in the room, every window, every mirror. If she sees herself, she'll know she's not alone. She'll see you, and if she sees you, you become her." She then told me a story, her voice a hollow monotone. A tenant from the 1970s, a young man who dismissed the rumors just as I had. He'd thrown a party, made a joke about Eleanor, and ignored the lullaby. The police found the house empty, the furniture moved into the shape of a bed. A single shattered mirror lay on the floor, and the only thing missing was the young man himself. He just vanished, she finished, her eyes wide with a fear that was contagious. Mrs. Callahan's story hung in the air like a shroud. I was pacing, my mind racing. Sarah, however, seemed to have taken on a new, grim determination. "Ethan," she said, her voice shaking but firm, "I'm going to spend the night. We're going to follow the rules, every single one of them. We'll figure this out together." I felt a flicker of hope, a small spark of light in the growing darkness. Sarah's presence made the house seem less of a tomb and more of a problem to be solved. That night, the house was strangely quiet. The lullaby was a distant hum, easily ignored. Sarah and I stayed up late researching. We found more articles about Thomas Miller, a wealthy, respected man who was seen as the town's founding father. There was no mention of a divorce or a troubled marriage. The town had scrubbed Eleanor from history, leaving only the lie. Frustration built in me, a slow, simmering heat. It wasn't just the ghost. It was the house, the secrets, the rules. It was all a trap. At midnight, as a clock downstairs chimed ominously, a series of muffled thuds and scratches came from the attic. I felt a surge of irrational anger. "Eleanor, stop it," I muttered under my breath, my voice low but laced with fury. The house responded. The clock on the wall shuddered and fell, its glass cracking on the hardwood floor. A cold gust of wind, impossible in a sealed house, blew through the room. The portraits on the walls began to swing wildly, their faces morphing into distorted, grotesque smiles. Sarah screamed. The ground beneath our feet shook violently, as if a great beast was trying to break free from the house's foundation. It was no longer a silent haunting. It was an angry, visceral assault. We locked ourselves in my bedroom. The shaking stopped, but the horror was just beginning. Through a crack in the door, I saw a woman in a faded, white dress standing in the hallway. Her hair was a tangled, dark mess, and her eyes were not hollow, as I had imagined, but completely black, like deep, starless space. She wasn't solid, but a shimmering, distorted figure. She turned her head slowly, her neck cracking with an audible snap. I slammed the door shut, locking it and pushing a heavy chest of drawers against it. We huddled in a corner, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. We heard her, the sound of long, sharp nails scraping against the outside of the door, a chilling, deliberate, slow-motion scrape that went on for an eternity. I found Sarah huddled in a fetal position, her face buried in her hands. "She saw me," she sobbed. "I saw her too." I tried to comfort her, but I was trembling just as much. The scraping stopped, and a cold, damp silence fell over the house. The morning sun, when it finally arrived, was a weak, pathetic thing. Sarah and I emerged from the room, our faces pale and drawn. The chest of drawers was pushed back against the wall as if it weighed nothing. On the outside of the door, 3 long, deep gouges marred the wood, as if a wild animal had tried to claw its way in. It was a tangible, undeniable mark of the night's terror. "We have to leave," Sarah said, her voice a brittle whisper. "Right now. We have to go." I shook my head, my mind still cloudy with fear and adrenaline. "I can't," I said, my voice barely audible. "The house. It's all I have. I put everything into it. I thought of my wasted savings, my ruined marriage, the life I'd abandoned. This house was my last chance at a clean slate. I couldn't just run again." Sarah stared at me, her eyes a mix of fear and anger. "You're willing to die for this house, Ethan?" she asked, her voice cracking. "You're willing to let this ghost take another victim?" "We're not going to be victims," I said, a desperate lie I was trying to convince myself of. "We're going to fight this." "How?" she demanded. I had no answer, but Sarah did. "I know someone," she said, pulling out her phone, her fingers trembling. "A medium. I heard about her from a friend. She's supposed to be the real deal." The name on her screen, Madame Clara, glowed with a faint, hopeful light. The stage was set, and the battle was just beginning. Chapter 3. The Ghost's Wrath. The name Madame Clara on Sarah's phone screen was like a final prayer, a lifeline in the storm of terror. She had made contact, and the woman agreed to come immediately. She lived in a small nearby town, known as the Whisperer of the Dead. She arrived in the late afternoon, when the sunlight painted the dusty windows gold. Madame Clara wasn't what I expected from a medium. There were no flamboyant clothes or strange jewelry. She was a middle-aged woman with curly grey hair tied neatly back, a stern face and deep, weary eyes. She stepped into the house and said nothing, only closing her eyes briefly. A cold breeze passed through me. "This isn't a haunted house," she said, her voice raspy but commanding. "It's a trap." A trap for an angry spirit. Clara explained that Eleanor's spirit couldn't leave the house because of her unfulfilled vengeance. Her rage had bound her to the house, turning it into an invisible prison. "She doesn't want to kill you," Clara said. "She wants you to be her weapon for revenge." That night, I received a call from an unknown number. It was my ex-wife. Her voice was heavy with exhaustion and regret. "You know, I still think about everything that happened," she said. The conversation reopened old wounds, unspoken apologies, and the pain I had caused. Memories of my betrayal flooded back, every lie, every stolen touch, all haunting me now. When I hung up, a chill ran down my spine. Eleanor's locket appeared again. This time, it wasn't on my pillow but around my neck. I hadn't put it there. It was cold and heavy. I looked in the mirror and saw my own face, filled with guilt and fear. My face, I realized with horror, bore a terrifying resemblance to Thomas Miller. We decided to hold a séance, a spiritual ritual to communicate with Eleanor. Clara prepared candles and protective items, saying we needed to confront her to learn what she truly wanted. "She's here," Clara whispered, her eyes closed. "She's very angry." In that moment, a freezing surge of energy swept into the room as if a door to hell had opened. The candles went out. A large table slowly slid toward us. Chairs shifted and crashed into each other, creating eerie noises. A voice, dry and full of hatred, came from nowhere, echoing through the room, meant only for me. "You're no different from him." The voice reverberated in my mind, repeating Eleanor's accusations. It wasn't just about her death. It was a condemnation of my own sins. Clara, pale-faced, shouted, "She's trying to possess you." Her voice was frantic. "We have to stop her." She quickly gave a new, terrifying rule she hadn't wanted to share. "If she appears in a mirror, cover it immediately," she yelled. "If she sees you through it, she'll take your soul." Just like Thomas did, I ran to the bathroom, where a large mirror hung on the wall. As Clara warned, it wasn't my reflection I saw. A pale face with tangled hair and eyes full of tears and rage stared back. Eleanor Miller. She raised a bony, skeletal hand from the mirror, reaching for me. In panic, I grabbed a nearby towel and threw it over the mirror, covering it completely. I had acted just in time, but the chilling sensation of her trying to pull me in lingered. The séance ended in chaos. with objects flying and Eleanor's voice turning into a furious scream. Sarah was knocked down by an invisible force, a long, deep red scratch appearing on her arm. "What have you done?" she cried, her eyes filled with tears and fear. "You've made her angry." Scolded by Clara for ignoring her warnings, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. When the chaos subsided, we found another of Eleanor's diaries, hidden in a drawer in the attic wardrobe. It wasn't the old diary, but a blood-stained one, a final testament. In it, Eleanor wrote desperately about a missing child, a child Thomas had taken from her. Her final words, "My soul will never rest until my child is found." Chapter 4. The Curse Revealed. Eleanor's blood-stained diary, with its final words about her missing child, was the key. Sarah and I read it dozens of times, trying to piece together a century of pain and lies. Eleanor didn't want revenge for her death. She wanted her child. Her rage wasn't born of betrayed jealousy, but of a mother's loss. Sarah, with her vast historical knowledge, found a small detail in an old article. It was a photo of Thomas Miller with prominent townsmen standing outside a new bank. One man, with a stern face and cold eyes, bore a striking resemblance to someone in an old family photo of mine. "Look at this, Ethan," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "This is your great-grandfather, William Miller. He was Thomas's cousin." A chill ran down my spine. I wasn't a random stranger passing through. I belonged here. I was a descendant of those who hid the crime. I wasn't just a target. I was part of the problem. The weight of my ancestors' guilt pressed down on me, heavier than my own. After the séance, Eleanor no longer haunted only me. She began targeting Sarah. She woke each morning with strange bruises on her arms and legs. "I dream of her," she said, her eyes full of fear. "She keeps saying, 'Give me back my child.'" One night, a blood-curdling scream from Sarah's room jolted me awake. She was asleep, but her body convulsed, as if an invisible force was trying to pin her down. I tried to wake her, but it was no use. Her bed shook violently, and a cold breeze swept over me. I felt desperate. My guilt had dragged Sarah into this, and now she was suffering what I deserved. The need to protect her, mixed with fear, grew into something stronger. In desperation, we called Madame Clara again. This time, she wasn't weary, but resolute. She decided to perform a stronger exorcism ritual, using protective symbols and ancient prayers. She said she would try to close the door we had accidentally opened. But as she began, the house fought back. The walls in the room began to sweat a thick black and red liquid, like blood. Eleanor's voice no longer echoed in my head. It came from the floor, the ceiling, every corner, a chorus of pain and hatred. Clara was thrown against the wall by an invisible force. She collapsed, unconscious, a bleeding wound on her forehead. The protective symbols on the walls caught fire, eerie green flames dancing before extinguishing. The ritual had failed, and Eleanor had won. She was no longer contained. She had become the house. The next day, as news of the strange event spread, a group of townsfolk arrived, their faces filled with fear and anger. They hadn't come to help. They came to accuse. "You woke it up," an old man said, his voice thick with hatred. "It was supposed to stay buried." Another man, seemingly a community leader, revealed a painful truth. Eleanor hadn't died instantly. She had tried to escape with her child but failed. "The child died of fever, hidden in the woods," he said, his voice trembling. "Thomas ordered the child buried in secret. Our families and yours helped keep that secret. We've lived in fear," he said, his eyes welling with tears. afraid she'd come back someday. And now, she has. After they left, a deadly silence enveloped the house. I stood alone in the room where traces of the failed ritual remained. In a corner, Eleanor's locket, which had haunted me from the start, glowed with an eerie red light. I felt a freezing surge of energy, and Eleanor's voice whispered again, not in my head but right behind my ear, "Your blood will pay." It wasn't a question, it was a sentence, and I knew Eleanor's revenge wasn't about an object or a ritual. It was about blood, and I, a descendant of the guilty, was the final target. The inevitable confrontation was drawing near. Chapter 5. The Final Reckoning. Eleanor's sentence, "Your blood will pay," was the final blow, shattering any hope of a simple solution. This wasn't a problem to be solved with rituals or moving objects. It was about blood, lineage, and vengeance. Eleanor didn't want an apology. She wanted blood. I spent a long night thinking. The next morning, I went to Sarah. Her fear had turned into a cold determination. She had overcome her own terror to fight alongside me. And finally, I decided to confess. I cheated on my wife. I told her, my voice trembling. That's why she divorced me. I lied to her, I betrayed her, and I broke everything I promised. Sarah listened quietly. When I finished, she said nothing. She just hugged me, not out of pity, but understanding. "We'll get through this together," she said. "You're not alone anymore." "You have me." Afterward, I called my ex-wife. I apologized, not expecting forgiveness but to acknowledge my guilt. I needed to face myself, not just Eleanor's ghost. Right after the call, a chilling energy enveloped the house. But this time, it wasn't anger. It was an empty, sorrowful whisper. Eleanor's pain was subsiding. She no longer wanted blood. She wanted a confession. Then, we decided to confront Eleanor one last time. We went to the attic, where it all began. There were no moving objects, no screams, only a deadly silence. We found Eleanor's locket on the floor. I picked it up, and as I looked at her face, I saw her pain and tears. "Eleanor," I said, my voice soft but clear, "I acknowledge the sins of my ancestors. They hid the truth about your death. They took your child. I'm sorry." Then I burned the locket, a symbolic act of forgiveness. The flames flared, and I saw an eerie light rise and vanish. The house fell eerily silent, a gentle, peaceful silence. The next day, I held a small memorial for Eleanor. I invited townsfolk who knew her story. We read the final pages of her diary, and I shared her story. "Eleanor Miller wasn't a ghost," I said. "She was a mother who lost her child, and we did nothing to help her." Afterward, I buried the diary's ashes in a quiet place where she could rest. The haunting stopped, but the house remained, still carrying a cold, empty feeling. A month later, I moved out of the house. I found a small apartment in a nearby city, a peaceful place with no past. My life returned to normal, but the hauntings lingered in my mind. One night, I heard Eleanor's familiar lullaby again. It was no longer a hateful whisper but a sad melody. The locket, which I had burned, reappeared in my drawer. I realized Eleanor didn't want to leave. She wanted to follow me, to be part of my life. Sarah, who had moved to another city, called me. Her voice trembled. "I found it," she said. "Eleanor's locket." Years later, I lived a quieter, more cautious life. I used my inheritance to donate to organizations helping abused women, a way to atone for my sins and those of my ancestors. One night, alone in my apartment, a final whisper sounded. "I'm always watching you," it said. No longer Eleanor's voice, but a child's. I realized Eleanor had found peace, but something else had awakened. The confrontation was over, but a new chapter of horror had begun. The house went quiet, but its echoes carved scars in my heart. Ghosts, whether real or born of our mistakes, beg for truth. Redemption isn't running, it's facing the pain head on. Yet, a child's whisper hints that some shadows never fade. This tale dares you to face your own ghosts. Loved it? Join Night Morn on YouTube. Subscribe, like, and share your thoughts to keep exploring the dark with us. Until next time, let the truths you carry light your way.